watching Primetime. I'm Tamanna Inamdar.
And I'm Ayush Alavadi. Let's start off with the headlines. The IMF expects China to outpace India in 2017, cuts India's GDP forecast by half a percentage point to 6.7%, citing demonetization and GST.
Maharashtra joins Gujarat in cutting taxes on petrol and diesel. The Devendra Fadnavis government will lose 2,000 crore rupees in revenues.
Adani Transmission enters exclusive talks to buy Reliance Infrastructure's power business in Mumbai. Both stocks rally today.
Biocon rallies 7% after the company says the launch of its new cancer drug won't be delayed despite FDA worries.
Rahul Gandhi steps up his attack on Prime Minister Modi, says the economy is in doldrums due to poorly implemented policies. Amit Shah hits back, says Rahul cannot see development through his Italian spectacles.
There's yet another change at Facebook India. Managing Director Umang Bedi resigns. Sandeep Bhushan is named as interim head. Well, the International Monetary Fund has lowered India's growth forecast to 6.7% for 2017. This is half a percentage reduction from its previous two forecasts in April and July. IMF has attributed the cut in forecast to demonetization and the introduction of the goods and services tax. IMF also lowered the growth forecast for 2018 to 7.4% from the earlier forecast of 7.7%.
Now, the latest World Economic Outlook report from IMF puts China slightly ahead of India in terms of growth rate for this year. China is projected to grow at 6.8%. The report also noted that simplifying and easing labour market regulations and land acquisition procedures are long-standing requirements for improving the business climate in India.
Now, senior economist at ICRA, Aditi Nair, joins us on the phone line from New Delhi, and we're also going to be speaking to Madan Sabnavis in just a bit. Aditi, I'll start with you. What do you make of the IMF's cut in forecast and its 2018 numbers of 7.4%? Does it show that this is a short to medium-term pain that we're seeing?
Thanks. In terms of the cut in the FY18 growth forecast to 6.7%, that's really not surprising at all. We've seen over the last couple of months since the Q1 FY18 data came out to be lower than expected, that there have been a series of revisions in the growth forecast for FY18. We ourselves have marked down our forecast by 30 bips to 6.7%. Last week we saw the RBI also cut their forecast to the same number. And after that, I think the IMF, World Bank and others have also followed suit. So this is not the first time that we are seeing a cut like this. This is just a trend that has been there for some time. Not only the Q1 numbers were weaker than expected, but also the transitional impact of the GST has been more prolonged than what we had initially anticipated. And I think that's also a big factor. And added to that, the Kharif harvest in terms of the advanced estimates that we have so far are also weaker than what we would have thought at the beginning of the year when the monsoon first forecast had been released. So a combination of these factors have really led to the cut in the FY18 growth forecast to 6.7%.
Right. They also do mention that this is perhaps a temporary blip. When would you really expect this to revive and perhaps pick up?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well.
Hi, Aditi. This is Ayush. I was asking you, well, it is mentioned that in this report that it is a temporary blip. When would you expect, well, the growth forecast for India to revive really and catch up or perhaps overtake China yet again?
So I think what you're asking me is when I would expect India's growth forecast to start overtaking China again. So that is obviously a very complicated question. I think what we should focus on right now is more India's own growth trajectory and when we see growth revival coming in. Because if India does grow by 6.7% in FY18, that's going to be barely 10 bits more than the initial forecast that we have of the growth for FY17. So first of all, we need to make sure that this sort of trajectory again start showing an uptick. So we got to focus on what would be the drivers that could lead to an improvement in growth in FY19. And whether is this going to be a consumption-led growth, or can we really expect exports to be able to record a revival? And then, of course, the most elusive investment recovery, what would be the factors that would be able to drive that, and which sectors would lead the way? I think these are more important questions than just comparing with China and looking at whether...
In fact, their projections for 2018 do show that we'll be back to fastest growing economy by 2018, because China is projected to grow at 6.5 and we're at 7.1 as per the IMF. But I'm going to go to Madan Sabnavis as well. He's Chief Economist at Care Ratings. Very good evening, Mr. Sabnavis. My question to you is actually more on what we need to do next. And I'm asking this also in the context of the Prime Minister meeting his new Economic Advisory Council for the first time tomorrow. The IMF, of course, has also given its recommendations to what India must do, and it has, labor reforms and land reforms, etc. But in the short to medium term, what are the big steps that can be taken?
Yeah, good evening. In fact, I feel that there's nothing much that the government or anyone else can do, because this is the normal business cycle which we are witnessing, and there has to be a recovery which has to come from within, because the government has introduced a series of reforms, some of them which have worked, some of them which could have probably militated against growth. Like I think what the IMF is talking of in terms of demonetization has definitely something which has affected the demand side, and GST, which is causing disruptions on the supply side. So I think one has to be patient whenever we look at growth. I think there are no quick fixes. Growth is going to be gradual. There's going to be a recovery which the IMF is talking of. Even we at Care Ratings are expecting a recovery of around 0.5% in 18-19. But for the time being, I think a lot depends upon whether there's a growth, whether there's any kind of revival in demand, which we expect from the October months onwards. That's when it typically happens. And probably at that point of time, we can feel that we have probably come back to the old state before which we can look at acceleration. So in short, I think even though we have the PM's Economic Advisory Council going to do some hard thinking on this particular subject, I think we should try and separate things from what the government can do in terms of policies, which are enablers, and what actually is going to happen in the real world, that is actual investment, actual consumption, which will be left for the private sector participants to decide the course of action.
Yeah, in that context, Mr. Sabnavis, does this paring down by about 0.5% of India's growth forecast really, do you see it having an impact on India's attractiveness as an investment destination? Do you see any impact on FDI flows, etc., in the short to medium term?
See, I think the IMF have been very pragmatic by rolling down the growth rates and also specifying as to why is it that they have done so. So as I mentioned earlier, I think we have a demand side problem which was pushed back by demonetization. There has to be a recovery before gradual acceleration takes place. On the supply side, GST has definitely been a major disruption, especially for the SME segment. So therefore, there will be certain issues in terms of reconciliation with GST. But in terms of India remaining a favorite destination, I think that will continue, because if you look at the kind of excess capacity which is there in the country, when I talk of excess capacity, I mean opportunities which are there because of several lacunae which is there in the infrastructure sector, in the financial sector. So foreign direct investment will continue to go into those countries where there are large opportunities on account of steady growth seen, as well as a lacunae or other shortfalls shortfall or gaps which are there in certain sectors. So India will continue to be attractive.
Sure. I'm just going to wrap up with one question to Aditi. There has been a lot of talk on trying to calculate what demonetization has actually cost the GDP. A lot of numbers have been thrown around. After this IMF forecast talking about demonetization specifically, do we now have a clearer picture on the impact of demonetization?
I don't think so. I think we'll in any case have to wait for the next round of updated data on FY17 from the CSO, which would be released in a few months, to first look at an estimate of what growth was in Q3 and Q4 of last year, with greater information, particularly for the informal sector. So I think we need to have that exercise first to be able to really pin down what has the impact of demonetization been. I'm not sure that based on the IMF estimates, we can come to any kind of conclusion on that.
All right, thanks so much Aditi Nair and Madan Sabnavis for joining us on that quick conversation. And just a quick programming reminder, at 8:30 this evening, Finance Minister Arun Jaitley will discuss India's FDR reforms at Columbia University in New York. We're going to get you that speech live right here on Bloomberg Quint. You need to go nowhere.
All right, a recovery in India's capex cycle will remain elusive, at least for the next 3 to 4 years. That's the main message coming in from a report put out by India Ratings. The credit ratings agency says that stressed corporates may delay the capex revival. We caught up with the author of that report, Priyanka Poddar, to understand what can speed up that revival. Listen in.
The key driver that we think that will push the investment recovery beyond FY20 is the implementation of the insolvency and the bankruptcy code. Obviously, now there are pros and cons there. While this will help in the debt resolution of some of the stressed corporates, we think that the increased consolidation and the mergers and acquisition activity that is likely to happen in various sectors is likely to push back the investment cycle. While obviously the non-stressed corporates, having a higher capacity utilization, will be in a position to spend at that point in time, whereas these stressed corporates are likely to delay the overall recovery by another 2 years.
Now, Gujarat has become the first state to reduce the value-added tax on petrol and diesel. VAT on petrol and diesel has been cut by 4%. With this rate cut, the price of petrol will come down by 2 rupees 93 paise and that of diesel by 2 rupees 72 paise in the state of Gujarat. This comes after Finance Minister Arun Jaitley asked the state to reduce taxes on petrol and diesel.
Now, last week, central government brought down the excise duty on petrol and diesel by 2 rupees per litre. Chief Minister of Gujarat, Vijay Rupani, said that the state government will suffer a loss of 2,316 crore rupees annually due to the reduction in VAT. He also clarified that the decision was taken in the interest of people and should not be linked to polls. Yet another BJP-ruled state, Maharashtra, has also approved a reduction in VAT on petrol and diesel. Now, VAT on petrol and diesel has been cut by 2 rupees per litre, while VAT on diesel is cut by 1 rupees per litre. The price reduction will come into effect from midnight today. Finance Minister of Maharashtra, Sudhir Mungantiwar, termed the price cut on fuel as a Diwali gift to the people of the state. He also said that it will lead to an annual revenue loss of 2,000 crore rupees to the state, but added that the government is ready to bear the fiscal burden.
पेट्रोल में 2 रुपए कम किया है, डीजल में 1 रुपया कम किया है और इससे हमारे रेवेन्यू की हानि करीब 2000 करोड़ होगी। और केंद्र सरकार ने जो अपील की थी कि हमारी ओर से हम 2 रुपए कम कर रहे हैं, दामों में दरों को घटा रहे हैं, तो राज्यों ने भी घटाना चाहिए। तो केंद्र के कारभारी में हमने भी 2 रुपए कम कर दिए और डीजल में 1 रुपया कम कर दिया है।
Now, in a move that could change the fortunes of the beleaguered Anil Dhirubhai Ambani Group, Adani Transmission has entered exclusive talks to buy Reliance Infra's Mumbai power operations. Jayesh Khilnani of Bloomberg Quint sums up how the deal will aid both the companies in this particular report.
First and foremost, let's have a look at what the Mumbai business includes. So essentially it is generation, distribution and transmission of Reliance infrastructure. Now if you have a look at the proposal that the exchange carried this morning, there is something in it for Adani Transmission and Reliance Infrastructure. Now how does Reliance Infra benefit is that it will use the proceeds that they get from this deal to pay back their debt. Now if you have a look at the debt structure of the company as of FY17, they have a debt more than 25,000 crores, whereas the cash balance is just in excess of about 900 crores. And for the Adani Transmission, with this deal, they will get an entry into the power distribution business. Now, up until now, they were only in the transmission phase, and with this, they get entry into that as well. So, beneficial for Adani Transmission as well. As far as the financials of Adani Transmission are concerned, they have debt in excess of about 8,500 crores, whereas the cash balance is nearly 500 crores. crores. Now moving on, we know that Reliance Infrastructure has been meaning to sell this business for quite some time, and in fact the last 3 quarters during their earning media release, we saw that they have mentioned to the exchange that they are in advanced talks to monetize this business. However, nothing has materialized up until now, and let's see if this deal also goes through. Of course, lastly, the transaction is subject to approvals.
Now, with the deadline just hours away for businesses to file returns under GSTR1, lakhs of traders are yet to file their returns. Nikunj Johri is joining us with that update on the phone line. Nikunj, what are the numbers coming in so far?
So, Tamanna, around 43 lakh GSTR1 returns for the month of July have been filed as on 6 p.m. today. Out of the 65 lakh taxpayers who are eligible to file these returns for the month of July. Remember, taxpayers can file GSTR1 returns by midnight today. And just to give a background, government had collected around 95,000 crore in GST for the month of July. Although the GST Council has approved quarterly filing of returns for small taxpayers with turnover up to 1.5 crore rupees, they still have to file GSTR 1, 2 and 3 returns till September.
All right. Thanks for that update, Nikunj Johri there with all of those details. And Biocon and its partner in the United States, Mylan, have got a new letter from the US FDA on a biosimilar that they're working on. The complete response letter on the cancer drug means that the final approval is still pending. Darshan Mehta tells us if this letter will impact the commercial launch of Biocon's cancer drug in this report.
Now, the news for Biocon is that the company in the exchanges today morning indicated that its partner Mylan has received a complete response letter from the US FDA. Now, what was said in the complete response letter was the fact that there's no issue as far as this drug is concerned, pegfilgrastim, but there are issues as far as the plant is concerned. So they need more data before any kind of approval can come in because of this drug. Now, this drug is being manufactured jointly by Mylan and Biocon. Mylan is the marketing partner, Biocon is the manufacturing partner. It's a big drug, almost $3.5 billion is the US sales for this drug. Now, the target action date has lapsed because the decision of the US FDA was supposed to come in yesterday night. So that is out. So there will be more delay on Biocon's front. Now, how does this affect Biocon? Now, there are two views here. A couple of brokerages that came out indicated that this news is negative, given the fact that the approval will be delayed. There are still regulatory issues as far as Biocon's plant is concerned, and the product will take time to clear. So that is one view, and they consider it negative. The other view that has come out, and they expect this to be a positive, because they believe that the company says that the commercial timelines for Biocon won't change. That means, even though there is a delay here, the final product will be launched pretty much as expected by the end of 2018 or the first quarter of calendar year 2019. So that's the general view that's coming in, and they believe there are no issues as far as data is concerned, and the product is all right. So for a biology plant, that's extremely important. So two views coming in, but the market seems to be taking the view that despite this negative news that has come out, there's nothing wrong with it. They expect that the timelines will be met, and Biocon was up almost 8% in trade today.
Now, in what comes across as a major boost to Indian government's Make in India initiative, the French maker of Rafale fighter jets, Dassault Aviation SA, has expressed interest in building its business aircrafts in India. In fact, Chief Executive Officer of Dassault, Eric Trappier, has said that building the Falcon 2000 business aircraft would help reduce costs while giving the company a competitive edge also. Remember, last year, Dassault had bid for defense contracts worth $11 billion to supply 126 Rafale aircrafts. It eventually won an order for 36 planes.
And SEBI has moved the Supreme Court today, alleging obstruction by the Sahara Group in auctioning Ambi Valley. SEBI maintained in their plea that the Sahara Group is in direct contempt of the Apex Court's order. Remember, the Ambi Valley resort town was put on auction by the Supreme Court at a reserve price of 37,000 crore rupees. Arpan Chaturvedi brings us all the updates on the case in this report.
The Supreme Court has agreed to hear the contempt plea filed against Subrat Roy and the Sahara company. This plea was filed by market regulator SEBI, which said in their plea that Sahara Group has been creating hurdles as far as the auction process of the Ambi Valley property is concerned, which is a direct contempt of the Supreme Court order. Remember, in September 2017, the Supreme Court had ordered that the Ambi Valley property of the Sahara Group will be auctioned, and today SEBI's counsel approached the Supreme Court where they said that the Sahara Group is creating hurdles and that the official liquidator of the Bombay High Court has drawn up a schedule, and the first two steps of the auction had already taken place where the bids were invited, and the SEBI counsel asked today for an urgent hearing, once again saying that the Sahara Group has been creating certain hurdles in the auction process, and after that the Supreme Court has agreed to hear the plea filed by SEBI. There's no date right now fixed for it, but yes, the Supreme Court has agreed to hear the plea and the date will soon be decided.
Well, it might have taken some time, but the Nifty finished above the 10,000 mark for the first time in 3 weeks as Indian markets continued their rally. Both the benchmark indices clocked gains of around 0.25 percentage point. Broader markets outperformed the benchmark indices and eked out significant gains in trade. Among the individual sectors, utilities index performed strongly while the realty index ended up as the top loser. Pradeep Pandya of Bloomberg Quinn sums up the day's market action in this report.
Nifty closed above 10,000 mark for the first time in the month of October today. Sensex also moved up, but if you look at heavyweights, they were actually moving in a narrow range, and the gains were also limited to 0.25%. If you look at some of the heavyweights, Infosys was driving the markets up today after the company announced the timeline for their buyback offer process. RIL was another heavyweight that was moving up in today's trade. Also, on the positive side, we had private sector banks like Axis Bank and IndusInd Bank. Both these stocks were moving up with good volume. But interestingly, we should look at HDFC twins, HDFC and HDFC Bank. While the HDFC Bank gained by around 0.5% and contributed on the positive side, HDFC was on the negative side. And in fact, the stock fell only by a little over 0.25%. But given the kind of weightage that HDFC had, it had a significant impact on Nifty today. Also, ITC and HUL, two more heavyweights from FMCG sector, were quoting weak in today's trade. So that was the reason why index remained in a narrow range despite stellar performance by some of the sectors. Going beyond Nifty, if you look at some of the mid caps, Cochin Shipyard bagged up a huge order from Indian Navy, around 5,400 crore or so. That is the estimate for the order. Stock moved up by 11%. Adani Transmission is in talks to buy the Mumbai Circle distribution rights from Reliance Infra. So we had an impact on this stock as well. Biocon was a curious case today. While the development was somewhat negative, brokerages came out with reassuring reports and thereby actually helping the stock move up. Avenue Supermarts was also gaining up 6% in today's trade. South Indian Bank was a big loser in today's trade after gaining 16% over last 4 trading sessions, while the South Indian Bank actually came out with good numbers. If you look at the slippages, there were no new slippages or new NPAs, so to say, but bank had to make provisions for old NPAs that have already been sold to ARCs, and that was a big negative because profit came down significantly, and the stock also lost 6% on a day when the overall sector, especially the private banks, were doing quite well.
There's been a change of guard at Facebook India as Managing Director Umang Bedi resigned today. Sandeep Bhushan, who is Facebook's South Asia Director, will take charge as interim MD while the company hunts for a successor. Bloomberg Quinn's Nishant Sharma gives us all the updates in this report.
Facebook's India and South Asia Managing Director Umang Bedi today stepped down from his role at the company a little over a year after he joined the social networking giant. Now, Sandeep Bhushan, who is the Director for Consumer and Media for South Asian region, will be the interim MD for Facebook as the company looks for a full-time successor to Bedi. Umang Bedi had joined Facebook in July 2016 from Adobe India, where he was the Managing Director for the South Asian region and had replaced Kritika Reddy, who moved to US to head global accounts for Facebook. Although it's not clear at this point of time what exactly led to Bedi's exit, however, he will still remain with Facebook till December end.
Going too short. Now, back in 2015, Justice Kanadia, the Bombay High Court passed an order restricting the sale of firecrackers in residential areas in Mumbai. And today, Well, actually, yesterday, the Bombay High Court refused the plea of 2 firecracker dealers who were seeking temporary licenses to set up shop in residential areas here in Mumbai. The dealers had pleaded that temporary licenses be issued since their permanent licenses were not being renewed by the government. Now, based on the 2015 order, firecrackers will not be sold in residential areas in Mumbai. Now, the Yogi Adityanath government plans to build a statue of Lord Ram on the banks of the river Sarayu in the temple town of Ayodhya. The Communique stated that the statue will be built at the Saryu Ghat after clearance from the National Green Tribunal, or the NGT. The proposal was presented to Governor Ram Nayak as part of the State Tourism Department's initiatives to promote religious tourism in the city. A report in the Indian Express stated that the height of the statue could be close to 100 meters.
Now, Congress Vice President Rahul Gandhi has stepped up his attack on Prime Minister Modi and the BJP. On day 2 of his rally in Gujarat, Rahul Gandhi said that demonetization and a poorly implemented GST has crippled the economy. He also accused the BJP for not creating enough jobs. In response, BJP President Amit Shah said that Rahul Gandhi cannot see development in Gujarat because he has his quote-unquote Italian spectacles on. Amit Shah, along with other top BJP leaders, including Union Minister Smriti Irani, took part in a rally in Rahul Gandhi's constituency of Amethi. Smriti Irani also hit out at Rahul and questioned why his own constituency, Amethi, had not seen any development.
आपको सेल्फी लेने में बड़े मजे आ रहे हैं, नहीं बाबा सुनो, आपको सेल्फी लेने में बड़े मजे आ रहे हैं, मगर उस फोन ने चाइनीज युवा को जॉब दिया है, हिंदुस्तानी युवा को जॉब नहीं दिया है। मोदी जी का फोकस जॉब्स पे नहीं है और आपके भविष्य के लिए, हम सब के भविष्य के लिए देश के फोकस को जॉब्स पे लाना पड़ेगा।
विकास के ऊपर भाषण देते हैं, लेकिन शायद हमारे देश के कई नागरिकों को इस बात का एहसास नहीं है कि राहुल जी जिस लोकसभा क्षेत्र के प्रतिनिधि हैं, उस लोकसभा क्षेत्र में आज तक कलेक्टर का ऑफिस तक नहीं बना है। वो भी बनाने का सौभाग्य भारतीय जनता पार्टी को प्राप्त हुआ। राहुल जी भले ही गुजरात में विकास का उपहास करते हों, लेकिन सही मजाक उन्होंने अपने लोकसभा क्षेत्र के लोगों के साथ किया। रिश्तों की दुहाई देते हुए आज तक वोट तो बहुत बटोरे उन्होंने, लेकिन विकास रूपी एक भी कार्य वो जनता के समक्ष कर नहीं पाए।
Now, with the assembly elections just about 2 months away, BJP and Congress are making every effort, to really woo people from Gujarat. Up next, we'll get you a special chat on what are the dynamics of the parties in the state.
And weak discoms continue to hold India's power sector hostage. That's the word from Vinayak Chatterjee, chairman at Feedback Infra. In a conversation with Bloomberg Quint earlier today, Mr. Chatterjee said that privatizing distribution is the best solution to the country's power concerns. He added that there is an urgent need to fix the irrational pricing in the renewable energy sector. Listen in to a slice of that conversation.
The advantage with steel sector stressed assets is that the output of a steel plant can be sold in the open market. The fundamental problem with the power sector is that the tail wags the dog, in a sense that the sector, in my view, and I've been saying this openly, is being held ransom by the clutch of 45 plus state-owned discoms. When I mean state, I mean the federal state structure. It is a sector which is being held hostage by the 30-40 years of sheer degradation of the functions and the standards and the governance of discoms. The entire sector is being held to ransom, whether it is coal or whether it is renewables. Now, unless the discom story is set right operationally and not financially. See, the Uday schemes attempted to set right the discom financially by providing a bit of financial relief. But the flip side of the coin is that they were mandated to reduce AT&C losses to 15% by 2019. I am not sure that's going to happen. So until something drastic is done to actually address in a surgical strike mode the distribution sector in this country, I am afraid the pessimism on the traditional power sector in terms of generators of power will continue to remain and continue to be stressed. So the million-dollar question is, what can you do to the distribution sector? There is a two-pronged attack which I have been advocating for a long time. One is that you have to really step on the gas on allowing private sector to run distribution circles. There are many models to do that, and I don't want to take the time of your audience to detail all of them. But get private sector into electricity distribution, period. Strategy number 2, set up a national power trading and distribution company. I have always been saying that India, the center, its power is a concurrent subject, and the center has always played a key role in fuels. For example, it owns coal. I mean, the central government owns interests in coal and other forms of energy. It plays a key role in generation through NTPC. It plays a key role in equipment through BHEL. It plays a key role in transmission through power grid. But when it comes to the distribution sector, it kind of throws up in hands and says it's a state subject. I don't think the Indian public is buying that anymore, or the time has passed to just take a back seat and say, oh, we are trying to persuade the states. It is time for the center to act, and the simple message we have, or the suggestion we have for the center, is immediately set up a national power procurement and distribution company, and this company fully funded, it should be funded to the extent of 50,000 to 100,000 crores, should pick up the power of all stranded assets. Whatever the state discoms can pick up, God bless them, let them pick it up. Whatever is left as unutilized capacity, the nation has many, many hours of blackouts and darknesses so many decades after independence. That is unsustainable, including Prime Minister's own vision of 24/7 power. How are we going to give 24/7 power? The stranded capacities, the unutilized capacities of all these power plants should be picked up by the National Power Company and then distributed to start with central government entities like railways, ports, airports, government buildings, anybody who wishes to buy the power. First call to the state discoms, whatever they don't pick up, the center picks up and distributes under the open access policy. This is the kind of action that we want now in the power sector. You reform distribution and you have opened up the power sector to rainbow days again.
Have you pitched this, sir, to the government? Seems like a well thought out plan. I'm wondering whether they've called you in to structure it for them.
I have repeatedly written articles on Business Standard. I have espoused this thought from the erstwhile Planning Commission to including meetings with Shri Piyush Goyal when he was Power Minister. It is a thought where most people say it's a good idea, but I do not find sufficient action after having said, yes, it's an idea worth pursuing.
So one last question from me on power. You already answered my question on whether discoms have seen any operational improvement or not, so I'll skip that one. But, you know, all of this renewable energy action that we are seeing, tariffs coming down, you know, states threatening to renegotiate power purchase agreements, all of that is also coming from this fact, right, that the discoms actually haven't reformed in the way that they should have. So they'll keep trying to do this little bit here, there to try and save costs.
You know, we have a completely distorted market structure, and I wonder why discoms do not come under the purview of the Competition Commission of India. The Competition Commission of India has two major charters to prevent: abuse of dominance and collusive behavior. So I'm not saying discoms are into collusive behavior, but they're certainly suspect under the umbrella of abuse of dominance. Please remember that a discom is by very definition a geographic monopoly. So you've got a very, very uneven market structure where you've got a spate of sellers of power in a competitive market, and you've got one single geographical monopoly as the buyer, and that buyer is accountable to nobody because the state regulators have become toothless. So this monopoly buyer is accountable to nobody for its actions, good and bad. And in the recent times, we have only seen recalcitrant behavior in the way they renegotiate or twist arms on PPAs, the way they do not honor their commitments, the way they haven't speedily done governance of their own activities. There is a spate, and the way they handle the whole sector. So I would strongly argue that any behavior of discoms which is abuse of dominance as a regional geographic monopoly should immediately be brought to the attention of the Competition Commission of India. Why is it that such entities are left out of their purview?
Mahindra & Mahindra today unveiled a refurbished version of its entry-level SUV, that's the KUV. The automaker has not been successful in the category so far and is trying to make a mark by keeping prices unchanged. Bloomberg Quint's Alex Matthew caught up with Rajen Vadhera, President, Automotive Division, M&M, who accepted that the competition is only increasing, especially in the entry-level segment. Listen in.
Competition really is heating up. That's launches.
Exactly.
But that's going to scrunch margins for the entire sector, you feel?
Yes, it's a difficult sector. It's a sort of entry level. So therefore, margins in this product are less, but we don't believe in losing money.
Fair enough. And it's a very valid point. Speaking about margins and the festive season that we've just entered, discounting, do you think it's at elevated levels going into the festive season right now?
Yes, I think.
And what are the extent of discounts that you've seen?
I mean, quite significant. I think they're ranging from 25,000 up to 70, 80,000 on compact and mid-size vehicles.
Okay, fair enough. And with regard to overall perspective of this festive season, do you think it's at least a little better than the last year? What are the initial indications telling you?
Not better than last year, maybe on similar lines.
Well, let's cut across now to the event going on at Columbia University, where a professor of economics and former Niti Aayog chief Arvind Panagria is speaking right now. He's just about to introduce Finance Minister Arun Jaitley, who will be speaking there shortly.
By Prime Minister Narendra Modi. In the first National Democratic Alliance, which was headed by Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee from 1998 to 2004, Mr. Jaitley had held ministries of Commerce and Industry, Law and Justice, Company Affairs, Disinvestment, and Shipping. I am sure my list is not exhaustive, but it should give you an idea of the depth and breadth of Mr. Jaitley's contributions to the progress of the nation. In each of the ministries, Mr. Jaitley has held, he has promoted in a major way the cause of economic reforms, and this is true both under Prime Minister Vajpayee and now, of course, under Prime Minister Modi. Lots and lots of reforms that India undertook were actually also introduced during Prime Minister Vajpayee's prime ministership, preceded by, of course, the reforms that were done by Prime Minister Narasimha Rao. These reforms are too numerous to list in this short introduction. Nevertheless, let me mention that Mr. Jaitley has led two extremely important, difficult recent reforms: Insolvency and Bankruptcy Act and Goods and Services Tax. Insolvency and Bankruptcy Act is something I had written for a long time for, that India lacked a state-of-the-art modern bankruptcy law, and I was very pleased when finally under Mr. Jaitley's leadership this has actually happened. The Goods and Services Tax in particular also involved a constitutional amendment and multiple legislations. It also required forging an agreement among India's 29 disparate states. Another key reform, the cleaning of the non-performing assets of the public sector banks, which the government had actually inherited from the previous one, is also currently underway. Mr. Jaitley is also an eminent lawyer. His influence and imprint on the legal profession is so pronounced that even if he had not been a famous politician, his place in history would be preserved as a leading figure in the legal profession in India. And only now, I just was learning from Mr. Jaitley as we were talking that the family of Justice P.N. Bhagwati, brother of Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, was very close or is very close to Mr. Jaitley as well. Remarkably, Mr. Jaitley has practiced law in India's highest courts, the Supreme Court, with great distinction in 3 different branches: criminal law, constitutional law, and corporate law. His clients cover the political spectrum from Sharad Yadav of the Janata Dal to Madhav Rao Sindhia of the Indian National Congress to L.K. Advani of Bharatiya Janata Party. He has represented many multinationals, including PepsiCo and Coca-Cola both, and major industrialists such as Birla family. As a last point of introduction, let me also state that at a personal level, Mr. Jaitley is a very generous human being. Hailing as he does from a philanthropic family, perhaps this comes naturally to him. He rarely turns anyone away who seeks his help, whether financial or otherwise. During my 3 years in India, I ran into many individuals who narrated their stories of how Mr. Jaitley had offered them a helping hand with no expectation whatsoever that they would ever be in a position to return the favor. During my own tenure, I twice ran into rough spots and went to Mr. Jaitley for help. Each time he obliged, taking the necessary action to remove the hurdles in my way in less than 24 hours. Friends, it gives me a great pleasure great personal pleasure to bring to you India's distinguished Finance Minister, Mr. Arun Jaitley. Today, he will speak on policies and initiatives for promoting growth and investment in India. Thank you.
Dean Merit Jono, Professor Bhagwati, Ambassador Sarna, Dr. Panigriya, distinguished members of the faculty and friends. It's always a pleasure to be at Columbia. I recollect that the first time I was invited probably to this very room was in 2013 when we were in government, when we were in opposition, sorry. And there was a likelihood of being in government shortly. And the last time I was here when the Deepak and the Neera Raj Center was launched somewhere in one of the beautiful open spaces outside at a similar meeting which was held a few years ago. I remember when I had first come here in 2013, and obviously then in opposition, we were analyzing as to what were the challenges and the problems which were ailing India's economy at that time. And one of the principal issues, amongst the principal issues which we had raised was with regard to both the inability of the political leadership to take decisions, the inability to decide what the direction really has to be, and their inability really to get out of controversies which really create a hurdle in the decision-making process. One's credibility is lost because of all kinds of allegations of collateral motives, corruptions. Then your credibility itself suffers, and in developing economies it happens all the more. It was therefore a challenge before us to establish the credibility of the decision-making process of the Indian economy itself. And in order to establish that credibility, one of the important challenges obviously had been that you must have, both in terms of speed, a quick decision-making process. You must have an ability to even take tougher decisions. And you must have a complete clarity about the direction in which you want. Democracies obviously have their limitations because several decisions have to go through Parliament, and parliaments have their own timetables to determine because of the prevailing political situation. And keeping that in mind, I can today look back and say that consistently this was the policy of the Prime Minister and the government. At regular interval, one after the other, a lot of unfinished tasks with regard to decision-making in the Indian economy had to be done. And therefore, one after the other, each one of those decisions really is being taken. I can't say that the task is anywhere near completion. In a process of this kind, there will never be a finishing line. And therefore, one really has to have a clarity about the direction in which we want to move. And we must resist the temptation of ever moving in a contrarian direction. The Indian model now seems to be emerging. I think one thing is absolutely clear to most close observers of India, that when we started our reform process in 1991, we probably started it some decades late. But having started it few decades late, the direction that we followed probably was a direction which has helped India considerably, and therefore any form of debate, discussion or suggestions to go back to more regulation, to go back to stricter controls, not to integrate yourself itself, I think we've been in the process of dispelling any notion of that kind. If we look at, there were some decisions which were relatively easier for a government to take. Amongst easier decisions are decisions with regard to investment. Most of them don't require a parliamentary approval. In fact, in our case, only the insurance required a parliamentary approval. And one of the great debates when we took over was that a large number of companies internationally used to look up and ask us the question. I remember when I came here in 2014 or 15, I was asked a question, are you going to increase the FDI in insurance? That seemed to be the key issue. That now looks like a small minor reform which took place. And thereafter, consistently we looked at sector after sector. We convinced public opinion in India that domestic investment in India is grossly inadequate. What you require is additionality of evidence, and therefore we have to create an environment in India where people find India a friendly place to invest in. What were the hurdles? The first hurdle was that our doors were too narrow, our limits didn't allow them. The second hurdle was, even when we allowed them, between the decision to start businesses in India and the eventual commencement of business, you could spend years and years before you got your permissions. Your tax legislations were unclear, and you could be visited with a liability in India, a retrospective liability. And therefore it was quite a challenging task to convince investors all over the world who now regarded India as having fallen off the global radar at that time. In fact, I remember some of the leading economic magazines doing a story titled, "Will I Fall Off the Bricks?" I was being almost written off. And therefore, to restore back the credibility at that stage was extremely important. Now, on that front, if you actually test each one of those cases, in sector after sector, where there was a scope for opening up, we opened up. And I must say that in not one case, as is expected in developing economies, did we face a protest. I had actually kept my fingers crossed when I announced that normally in defense we would allow foreign investment. Defense was something which was being considered sacrosanct. And we would, in case where some special technologies come in, there would be no limits as far as that investment cap is concerned. We were watching the reactions. This was coupled with an argument that look at us today as the largest buyers of defense equipment in the world, going to foreign companies, foreign governments, spending foreign exchange. Why can't we request those companies to partner Indian companies and start manufacturing in India? And that's what the strategic partner policy, which I formulated in my brief spell as a defense minister, really indicates. That we now allow Indian companies certain platforms to be made exclusively by private sector. Indian companies who are entitled to enter into their tie-ups with foreign companies, and that's a process which now seems to have started off on the right track itself. And therefore, one after the other in sectors which were not opened up, we opened them up. Whatever were the conditionalities attached to that investment, a lot of those conditionalities were redundant. We removed those conditionalities. And then we realized that 95% of all investment coming into India was actually coming by the automatic route. And therefore, for 5%, we had a regulatory mechanism of the Foreign Investment Promotion Board. So you first come to your respective ministry, then you come to the board, you ask for multiple permissions, first by your ministry, then by your board. And this year I announced we are abolishing the board altogether. And therefore, if you are in a regulated sector, that 5%, you go directly to the ministry and that will regulate it. The result is that we became one of the largest recipients of foreign direct investment in India in this brief period. You then had to tackle this whole question, how do you create an environment which gives a comfort to the foreign investor? And let alone to the international investor, what gives a comfort to the domestic investor itself. A lot of people who have made investments in India found that the investments had been blocked up, the environment was not congenial, some technical objections, some taxation problems, etc. And worst of all, there was serious stigma that in developing economies, including India, corruption was a great disincentive as far as investment was concerned. And therefore you needed to wipe out that image, at least of political corruption as far as the government of India is concerned. And I can say with a sense of comfort, we've greatly succeeded in doing that. And there were essentially two areas which gave rise to that corruption. One was extraordinary amount of discretions vested in the government. Now, when ministers exercise discretion, you will have possible investors visiting them, people asking for favors. So the minister has the power to allocate call blocks, he has the power to decide the cost of spectrum, he has the power to use his discretion as to who gets an iron ore mine. I think all this required to be taken away from ministerial discretions and be left to a market mechanism. This required in several cases a change of law. And of course, with the strong public opinion backing it, a change of law was not very difficult. The second area, and I regret to say which still remains, is the world's largest democracy lacking transparent sources of political funding. And that's the second source. So this year in my budget speech, I addressed that. And I have given a formulation of people being entitled to buy electoral bonds through banking instruments and then donating those electoral bonds which can only be encashed by a political party. We are still in the process of working out all the formalities with the concerned institutions, and hopefully very soon it could see the light of day itself. And therefore it was extremely important to address these two important areas itself. The third, of course, was taxation. No retrospective tax we had announced. We didn't implement it. What do we do about the former ones? Assessments have been made. There were several suggestions made that you change the law. We came out with changes in law which allowed scope for settlement. And we left it to the judicial process to continuously decide. And most of those disputes, barring one or two, have gradually resolved themselves out. One or two remain. And I do hope that either by a judicial process or by a settlement, which is now statutorily provided in law itself, those could be settled out. India's direct taxes needed to be reformed. So two important changes I'll just refer to. One is eliminate, to the extent possible, the interface between an assessing officer and an assessee. So today, most people in India, almost all, file their returns online. Queries are addressed to them online. 99% of them receive their assessment orders online. So they don't go to the tax office ever. A few cases, because India is still a tax non-compliant society in many ways, some of those cases come up for scrutiny, but I can tell you the number of cases I've checked up year after year, the figure which come up for scrutiny now has come down to 1% of the total returns filed. And therefore that figure itself has come down quite radically itself. The next big challenge which Professor Panigria just referred to was the goods and services tax. We have central government, state governments charging multiple taxes. Each assessment added to the cost. At each stage of tax, there was tax on tax. And therefore, the costs multiplied. There was multiple interface with assessing authorities. And therefore, to perceive of a common taxation system across the country, which would allow a free flow of goods and commodities across the country, goods and services, was needed. How do you build a political consensus? I must say it was difficult. But at the end of the day, I would give full credit also to the states in India, which realized that they would be the eventual beneficiaries. And therefore, even when their parent political parties were talking a different language, the state governments all acted in tandem. And one after the other, each one of them started supporting it. The result was very obvious that we could pass the Constitution Amendment, we could pass the multiple legislations. And I would say today, after 3 months of its implementation, we have an effective functioning council in place. A council where there is, which is India's first federal institution, which decides by unanimity. And as we are going through the whole process of initial days, we are also learning our lessons. And one of the lessons which we are learning is, of course, there are problems which arise from time to time which need to be corrected, that it's still the top taxpayers who pay most of the tax. The large bottom pays marginal amounts, and therefore their compliance burdens itself needs to be significantly reduced itself. And I see as it will go on for days and months to come, we see an important movement in the direction where the base itself is increasing. The process will be much simpler, and like the direct tax, most of the assessments and the compliances will be online. The interaction between the assessing officer and the assessee itself would gradually become extremely negligible itself. The IBC is an important challenge, the Insolvency and the Banking Code. There are businesses which thought that, well, you can continue to collect money from banks and not have to repay it. And during the boom period and thereafter, there was mindless lending. And we've tried various experiments through the central bank restructuring formulations, not very successful. And therefore, we've reached a situation where we realized that it was not possible for the system to go on. The IBC is early days, and I'm looking at some early harvest as far as the IBC is concerned, in order to make sure that the banks can realize some money, and we have an institutional mechanism in place so that a proper exit policy as far as these non-performing assets is concerned is offered. One big reform which has taken place is the technology-based Aadhaar platform. The Aadhaar platform gives to every Indian the unique identity, and today the transfer of all state support has already become substantially into the bank accounts itself. And this experiment is going to continue to expand. This has also resulted in eliminating leakages, targeting the eventual beneficiaries, and making sure that the most deserving get the benefit directly without any leakage into their bank accounts. Today you have millions and millions of people who have the benefit of this. We've had highly successful programs like the Financial Inclusion Program, where you had 300 million Indians who didn't have access to the banking system, who now have access to the banking system. And therefore, these are areas which seem to be moving on the strength of the technology base in the right direction. Investment in infrastructure year after year is being stepped up. And therefore, today we have, and during the interaction, and I'm going to leave a lot of substantial time for interaction itself and keeping my opening remarks short, we have, whether it's the railways or it's the airports or it's the airlines or it's the seaports, the highways, year after year we've stepped up the largest possible expenditure we can make as far as infrastructure is concerned. And the second area has been the rural infrastructure, conventionally neglected. So what is the India we are looking at? We are looking at an India where every village gets connected to a road. A village has a paka house. Every house has a sanitation facility. Every village has electricity. And under the new scheme we've announced by 2019, within that electrified village, every home has an electric connection. So that the benefit of the growth can really percolate down to the rural areas where you require these people to really move up. Of course, there's the big issue, and I think in the course of the discussion that will follow, I'll deal with it in details. The consistent steps we've taken to formalize and expand the more formal economy as far as India is concerned. And wanting to formalize that economy, one after the other steps against shadow economy, and finally culminating into the demonetization, which I do firmly believe has been a very positive step in the process of shaking what was the conventional Indian normal of continuing to deal as far as cash is concerned. Some of these steps, the demonetization, the GST, because the GST could lead to destocking of existing stocks, can have for a quarter or so a transient impact on manufacturing. But in the long run, these are institutional reforms, these are structural changes, and these structural changes, I think, put the Indian economy on a far more sounder track so that we can look forward for a much cleaner, much bigger Indian economy in the days and years to come. I've consciously and deliberately kept my opening comments short because I'm told there is an interaction which is planned, and I think that will be a far more useful exercise. Thank you very much once again.
Okay, so we will open to the floor the question and answer session. Identify yourself and please ask the question. No long comments. If you do try to do long comments, I'm going to cut you out. So we begin with Professor Bhagwati here. The microphone is coming.
Well, that was a very fascinating talk, and since you've invited some comments, there was one which particularly bothered me, which is really, since you're a lawyer in the Supreme Court as well, you're quite right to emphasize the importance of the Aadhaar reform. But the Supreme Court has just found that it invades privacy. How do you expect to get around that problem?
Professor Bhagwati, I had an opportunity to pilot the Aadhaar bill in Parliament. And when I piloted that bill, the questions of privacy arose at that time. When the earlier government had introduced the concept of the UID and Aadhaar, there was no legislation. There was an ordinary executive order that let's start enrolling people. We felt that it's such a long-term measure that it will require a regulation, because issues of privacy will come up. Now, in the 1950s and early 60s, we had a judgment of the two different judgments of the Supreme Court, both of which in the 50s and the 60s had said that privacy is not a fundamental right in India. Because that was the conventional view, because a fundamental right is what is stated in the Constitution. And the Constitution specifically did not state privacy as a fundamental right. And that was the view of a very large bench. And therefore an argument was going on in courts, even by government lawyers at times, that you're challenging Aadhaar on the grounds of privacy, but privacy is not a fundamental right. The courts in 50s and 60s have said this. I had frankly anticipated the change. And while answering the debate, and while drafting the provisions, I had said, even though the existing law is it's not a fundamental right, but I think what applied in 1954 won't apply in 2016. That time I was piloting the bill in 2016. And therefore in 2016 it may be too late to contend that privacy is not a fundamental right. And therefore provisions of privacy protection have to be introduced as a part of this bill. So there is a chapter in the Aadhaar law which in detail deals with privacy. And when it deals with privacy, the manner in which the data is to be protected, the consequences of violation, the fact that the data can't be made public even with your own consent. So all those safeguard provisions have been brought into the law. Now, when the matter was challenged in the Supreme Court hasn't gone on to Aadhaar, but they only went into this question, is the law of the 1950s a valid law? And the Supreme Court now says, in 2017, you can't really contend that privacy is not a fundamental right. Privacy is a fundamental right. But because it's now being brought in really by a judicial construction and not by the original statute, how do you regulate it? Because if it's a part of Article 21 of the Indian Constitution, Article 21 reads that no person can be deprived of his right to life and liberty without procedure established by law. Now that procedure has to be fair and just. That's your Justice Bhagwati's judgment in Medicare. And then some of the judges go into what will be the exceptions to the law of privacy. So the first exception they say is national security. The second exception they say is detection of crime or prevention of crime. The third exception they say is dissipation of social benefits, socio-economic benefits. And I do believe that this third exception which they've carved out has been carved out specifically to protect Aadhaar. These are only illustrative, not conclusive, but there are at least two others, and one of the judges refers to it, which is larger revenue. For instance, nobody can say, I'll spend 1 crore of rupees in cash and you can't ask me the source. It violates my privacy because revenue detection, or for that matter, steps to check corruption. As a public servant, I can't collect illegal assets and put them in my wife or my son's name and say they have a right to privacy, you can't ask them. So if you are to investigate corruption, you have a right to ask them. So I think these exceptions have been well brought out in the judgment itself. So I do believe that the Supreme Court judgment on the privacy matter, in accordance with the current timing, is a correct judgment, and it lays down the correct exceptions, which protects Aadhaar.
Thank you. Okay.
I'm Yashashri Soman. I'm a second-year student at SEPA. I had two questions. One was, in a country like India, which sort of is the largest democracy, was the demonetization process, in your opinion, a democratic process, presuming that from the media reports that we read, only a few ministers and probably even the governor wasn't completely aware of the process? The second was, while a lot of thought, or it seems a lot of thought was put into demonetization and GST policy making, the implementation was highly flawed. So do you think there was a lot of thought given to the implementation of these policies in comparison to how much was put into policy making?
I'll deal with, I'm glad, and that's why I only briefly referred to them in the opening, because I thought the discussion would involve some of these questions. First, let's come to your question of a democratic process on demonetization. What was the object of demonetization? The object of demonetization was, if we see the factual situation, India is one economy which was hugely cash dominated. Cash dominated to this extent that cash was almost 12.5% of our GDP. In that cash domination, the high value currency was 86%. And high value currency means a large part of it is not being transacted in the market. It goes from one cupboard to another. The consequence of this was that the culture of dealing in cash was the predominant culture of spending in India. It became a habit. It eroded a lot of ethics and morality in both private and public dealings. I refer to public dealings, the entire political funding in India is through cash. What revenue collects is a minuscule percentage of what revenue should actually be collecting. And this is money which the poor in India are deprived of, because this is the money which has to go for development. Thirdly, a lot of this money has anonymity. It is being circulating in the market. Its ownership is not known. And it's a source of corruption. It's created a situation that you can't buy a property in India without paying part of the consideration in cash. When you transact your business, a large part, you maintain two sets of account books. In fact, a number of trades in GST who have no additional liability of tax in GST actually were opposing GST because for the purposes of payment of income tax, at least their turnovers will now get known. Even if the taxation, the indirect tax itself was not increased. One additional fact I'll mention, and I'll make good it with the facts, that you had in two areas at least we've seen, and three I can say, Kashmir Valley for certain, Central India Maoism, and maybe Northeast in some parts. This became a great source of strength for insurgent organizations. Now these are all the consequences of cash. Now, in several other economies, and that's the view, if some of the critical economists also mentioned this, they were all used to dealing with currency replacement in societies which are predominantly tax compliant. Here you are dealing with a currency replacement in a society which was predominantly tax non-compliant. And therefore, secrecy was the essence of that decision making. And I think one of the greatest successes of demonetization was that the Prime Minister and the team, obviously the RBI was involved, the Finance Ministry was involved, were able to keep it a close guarded secret. Otherwise, in a process where you take a decision, you have the alternate currency printed, you have thousands of people in the printing presses who are involved in that whole process, who don't know the reason why these new notes are being printed. You collect them, you tabulate them, you send them to the currency chest, and the moment you demonetize one currency, you have to be ready with the alternate currency. Otherwise, you can't create a vacuum in the market. And therefore, you are ready to deposit it with the currency chest. And still, we were able to keep this a closely guarded secret. Now, transparency is a very nice word, but transparency in this case would have been the greatest instrument of fraud. because you would have announced it, people would have been buying gold and land and diamonds and doing various kinds of transactions with the cash they already had. As it is, we saw that post-demonetization, a lot of people tried to get around it. Now, many of them are being held accountable today because we have this Operation Clean Money which is on to answer as to where they got these large deposits from. Now, what are the post-demonetization impacts itself? This is on the implementation. Not a single incident of unrest took place in the country. When you have the largest ever currency replacement exercise which is on, you had inconvenience. You had television reporters going and provoking the crowds outside the banks. Are you feeling harassed? And the answer inevitably would be, yes, I am feeling harassed, but it's a good move. So you had a lot of popular support to the move. And eventually we now come down. In round one, we've managed to squeeze a large part of the cash currency. That 12.5 has become 9. Hopefully it will keep on reducing. So you'll have lesser cash currency. You almost doubled the number of digital transactions as far as the alternate method of dealing is concerned. And even when the number of corporate returns in India have remained the same, because corporates as it is was dealing in the declared money, the private individuals filing tax returns, the number has significantly gone up. I remember 3 years ago, I used to quote a figure of some 3.5 crore people paying tax in India. To just now, the revenue release figure, it's over 6 crores now. So you have a large number of people who now feel that they get into the tax net itself. And therefore, the 8th November was the date of demonetization, and by April, you had done with demonetization, you had finished the remonetization to the extent that you wanted to distribute the alternate currency itself. And therefore, now the central bank has the flexibility of handling the future situation as they want. The GST has been the smoothest possible transfer of one tax system to another. Now, GST will throw up situations which are not anticipated. For instance, we realize that there is no provision for exemptions in GST. There is a provision for refunds. The exporters' refund was taking a lot of time and their capital was being blocked. It was a legitimate demand, so we immediately met and rectified it. You can't say this is an implementation problem. These are challenges which a new system throws up. There is a second challenge which has been thrown up. And the second challenge which was thrown up was, after the first 2 months deposits, we realized that 95% of the GST has been paid by 400,000 assessees. So it's only the organized sector which is paying the substantial part of it. So the bottom base has to expand, but the tax component coming from there is relatively less. And therefore, is there a case then for reducing the compliance burden on the smaller ones and trying alternate means of getting them into the tax net? It's a lesson we learned from the first 2 months of implementation, and I think the lesson rightly was we should do that. So the first decision we took was, instead of doing it every month, you please do it quarterly, once in 3 months. Now, to get more people into the tax net. Now, this is not a problem a lot of economists in developed economies would have dealt with, and therefore we need a solution in a non-compliant economy. Last year, in the Income Tax Act, I started a new rate that for people below a certain limit, to get them into the habit of paying tax, because our tax base was so small. For direct tax, I introduced a 5% slab, which doesn't exist in any country in the world. So you just pay 5% on your income and just enter the tax net. This time in the GST, for anyone having a turnover of 1 crore rupees or below, if you are a manufacturer, you just pay 2%, and if you are a trader, you pay 1%. Now, therefore, in order to make sure that in a country which has been substantially non-compliant, that people start realizing that paying taxes is in larger national interest, it's in their own business interests, and therefore getting them into this habit away from this idea of not paying taxes. Now, these are all kinds of challenges that GST itself is throwing up. And therefore, we are retaining that flexibility because we are dealing with an extraordinary situation where 400,000 people are paying 95% of the GST.
Okay. All right, let's take it here. Thank you. My name is Siddhesh Shinde. I have one question going back to FDI. In your experience, what do you find was a better incentive mechanism to attract foreign investors? Were they long-term projects like the industrial corridors, or were they more short-term projects regarding everyday markets?
I think to the foreign investor, India has offered multiple choices. I think the greatest incentive was the size of the market, the purchasing power of the market, and particularly the size of the middle class. I think this was perhaps the greatest incentive. And additionally, which is the sectors in which they wanted to come. I think they obviously see a lot more potential in the service sector. So in areas like telecom, etc., you see a very large amount of FDIs come in. There are areas in manufacturing where people have come in several areas. And infrastructure, relatively less. We'd like more of it to come up. And if there is one sector, if I had a choice, I'd want infrastructure. And that is why the government has been taking the lead as far as infrastructure is concerned. In this year's budget, I had almost close to 4 lakh crores just kept for infrastructure. And if you see the kind of infrastructure projects currently on, I mentioned yesterday at a meeting here, that we have 250 highways currently under construction. We are in the process of allocating some 35 to 40 new airports for development in the regional areas. We are in the process of giving 400 odd railway stations to private sector for redevelopment as real estate hubs. And this is besides power and ports, etc. So there is a lot of potential as far as infrastructure is concerned. But I would like to see a lot more come into that area.
Okay, let's see here.
So I'm Divyam Nandrajo. I'm a first year student at CEPA. My question relates to 5 years down the line, because the initial agreement between the center and the states on the GST is that the center will compensate the states for all revenue loss of 5 years. What do you see happening 5 years down the line when the center stops compensating?
Well, I'm reasonably confident it will increase. For instance, I'll just give you an illustration. So far, the data is inadequate to study the long-term pattern on what the collections are going to be. And so far, the reason why it's inadequate, because in the first 2 months, the carried over stock of pre-30th June has already also been there. And therefore, the VAT collections are there with the states. The manufacturing was inadequate because they were getting rid of the old stocks. So it's still an inadequate data. But I think over the next few months, we'll be close to touching a situation where the states will continue with that 14% projected hike.
Okay, let's go here on this side. Yeah. You're too fine. So I tell you that, take it here.
Hi, my name is Shraman. I'm a master's student in economics. My question is related more towards the Make in India campaign, which is where I was working before I joined Columbia. So the government keeps citing these FDI figures as an effectiveness of how great policies have been, etc. But it's very well known now that the results are not showing in the manufacturing sector, which is the one sector that is needed for an initiative like Make in India to work. So you spoke about direction before. So what exactly is the direction? Because stuff like policies like GST have in fact had a detrimental effect on some sectors of the manufacturing sectors as well.
Please don't go by transient data. For the reason that the transient data, if I may use that, of the GST launch quarter would not be a representative data itself. Because, as I was just explaining in response to the earlier question, the 1st of July date was announced in advance. And therefore, it is quite obvious that when you transit from one scheme to another, one taxation system to another, in the month of June, July, to some extent spillover in August, that manufacturing would slow down and people would be getting rid of all their existing stocks and manufacture the new stocks under the new regime thereafter. So we currently were facing a situation where the transition process was on. I do believe that a combination of a better infrastructure, a larger market, and I think a better enabling regime would push up the manufacturing figures in the coming months and years. At the same time, the only caveat that I have is not on policy. It's not on ability of Indian entrepreneurs, which I do recognize is substantially there. I think we need to create an environment where the small and medium enterprises do continue to get more funding than what they are getting today from the banking system itself. I think that last point I said is extremely important.
Okay. All right. Go ahead.
Would you address the non-performing loans issue in the Indian banking sector?
You see, first of all, let's see the larger picture of the Indian banking. Today has the public sector banks as one part of it. And this is the PSB bank problem. The problem is real. And some of the banks had indiscriminately lent during and after the boom period. They lent in some sectors. And those loans have become extremely stressed. And various schemes which have been attempted by the Reserve Bank have had some impact, not a very significant impact. And therefore, as I mentioned, the IBC was absolutely necessary. But at the same time, while the IBC will take care of the stressed loans itself, my larger worry is that this could be addressed and then eventually absorbed. But this is, to what extent will it continue to adversely impact on the capacity of the banks to support growth? And therefore, a lot of banks have a lot of deposits lying with them, particularly post-demonetization, and they require more capital resources in them so as to be able to lend it to the sectors which need them. And that's a problem which is real, which is currently receiving our topmost attention.
Okay. We'll take two more. Okay, go to the back. Yeah, you're standing there. Back.
Well, that was Finance Minister Arun Jaitley at Columbia SIPA. Tamanna, a lot of things he actually mentioned, right from demonetization to GST to opening up FDI in India, and of course, well, the most interesting part were the questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting question-answer session. A lot of it coming from students and leading with Mr. Bhagwati himself.
Of course.
But that's all the time we have right now. We're going to take a very short break, but we're back next with Primetime Debate, where we're talking about the Gujarat Assembly elections. Just about 2 months away, is turning into a big political fight. That's debate number 1. For the second debate on Primetime Debate this evening, we're focusing on the real estate sector. Is there a revival ahead of the festive season? So a lot to look forward to, and we're back right after this break.
Stay tuned.